Hey, my name is Gaia Athena, and in this video I'm bringing you part 7 of my 2020 reading statistics. This first graph shows you the amount of books I read per month and then per year. I gave all the months a different color. For 2020, I read the most books in September. And secondly, I also read a lot of books in March. I am pretty sure in those 2 months that I also reread quite a few books. At least I remember rereading a lot of graphic novels and graphic memoirs in March. I can't quite remember for September, but I'm pretty sure I read a lot of graphic novels or something like that. Also, September was the month after I moved, and so I think after I finished doing most of the important unpacking, doing all the important unpacking and stuff like that, I was like, okay, now I want to rest and sit down, do lots of reading. But in early years, this has been different, so I thought it'd be interesting to compare, to see if there was maybe like a trend or something. But looking at it now, I don't think there is like a specific month that I always read more, really. It kind of varies a lot. Like in 2017, I read a lot in November, for example, but not much in January and February, nor in September and October. But then in 2016, I read a lot in October, for example. So yeah, I was kind of hoping to see more of a trend because I have seen from other people that they do have certain months in which they tend to more often read more, sort of thing. But yeah, it seems my reading is a little bit more random. Now, in 2020, it was a bit of a different year in that I bought a house in the beginning of February. So that explains why I didn't read much in February. Because, of course, I had just bought a house, so I spent a lot of time with that. And in August, we moved into the house. Yeah, the months between February and like half August, it was a bit of a different year, and of course, also with the pandemic. But yeah, so there's not as much of a trend here as I was hoping for, but well, at least it's pretty and colorful to look at. This is the books read per month, but then on absolute numbers rather than percentages. I guess I was hoping this would give a maybe a bit of a different picture, but I think it looks nice and colorful at least. In 2015 and 2016, I read a lot of books during the summer, so June, July, August. Well, May also. But very little in October. Now we have the books read per month, but then an individual bit for each month, I guess, if that makes sense. Because I like looking at colorful pictures. Then moving on to pages read per month, with again the same colors for the months. Again, I guess not as much of a trend. The months in which I read the most books are generally also the months in which I read the most pages, but not always. But at least it's looking nice and colorful. And here we have the pages read per month, but then in absolute numbers. Again, not really much that I get out of this graph, but it just looks pretty at least. And then the pages read per month, but then a different column for each month. And I just like the colors really. Maybe there are trends, but then I would have to specifically look up what I did in the previous years, which month, and well, stuff like that. So. Then we get to the pages read per genre, which is rather than looking at the amount of books I read in a genre, I'm looking at the amount of pages I read in a genre, because those are not always like similar, if that makes sense, because some genres tend to have longer books than others. For example, fantasy tends to have a longer books, whereas biographies and memoirs usually, I think most of the memoirs that I tend to read are not really long. Well, so I just thought it was interesting thing to include, though I do find it confusing that the color for contemporary fiction and the color for horror are very similar, but the one that's actually got a lot of pages read is contemporary fiction and not horror. But to me, that's a bit hard to see. But these are, like, I think maybe some of the default colors, and I wasn't able to always change it. So. And here is pages read per genre, but then in absolute numbers, rather than percentages that we had in the previous graph. And in 2020, it looks like in absolute amounts, I read quite a lot of science fiction pages, whereas in the previous few years that was less. Whereas I felt like the percentage stayed very similar. But, well. Then we have pages read per genre, but again with columns for each genre. Although this is a bit hard to see because of the high amount of contemporary fiction, it is a bit harder to see the rest. So we'll just move on. This is the smallest book read per year, which is not really that interesting, really. But after this, I'll show the longest book. Yeah. Then the longest book read per year. In 2020, the longest book I read that year was 796 pages, which is significantly less than the 5 years before then. But now you get why I showed you. These are just the smallest and the longest book graphs combined. Yeah. Then we get to the amount of days it took me to read a book. So, a lot of books that I read in the past 3 years took me only 1 day to read. When I say I read it in 1 day, it means I start it and finish it in the same day. So, it is possible then that day I also read another book. But it just means the start and finish date are the same date, if that makes sense. And it's 2 days if I start a book today and finish it tomorrow, that kind of thing. In 2020, I did quite a lot more buddy reads than in the years before. So I think that is part of the reason why I read more books that took longer. And I also read some longer books that obviously took me longer. I also, it happened quite a few times that I was reading more than one book at once. So that obviously means that per book it takes me longer. Most of the books that I read in 1 day are usually graphic novels, graphic memoirs, manga, comics, illustrated children's books. Book with mostly text that is like, let's say 300 pages. It normally takes me 2 or 3 days, really, at least, to read that. And this is the same graph about the amount of days it took to read books, but then with absolute value rather than percentage wise. Then lastly, for this part 5, we have the type of diversity in a book, and this is in absolute numbers. So I've only been tracking this for 2 years now. I should perhaps explain what I mean with diversity. Is more like the representation of minority groups. To me, it does not mean people different from myself, because I am neurodivergent. So, like 95% at least of all published books would have people that are neurotypical. So, that's not what I mean by this. I'll just go through it. So, we have first at the bottom neurodiversity. So, that is any book in which a main character is neurodiverse rather than neurotypical. Then we have mental health, and this means that the book has a mental health representation. It has a large role in the story. Then we have LGBT+. This is when a main character is part of the LGBTQ+ spectrum. Now, I and part of that as well. Then we have POC, or person of color. This means that the main character or main characters are people of color. So in this instance, I consider the majority group to be white, at least in English written literature as well as Dutch. So if all the characters in a book are white, the diversity is none if there is no other sort of elements. Then we have disability, and I really would like this number to be higher in the future. Then we have health and illness, and this is like books with anyone having a physical illness as opposed to mental illness. So let's say a book, person with cancer, a person that has to spend a lot of time in hospital, they have a surgery, but things like that. Then we have religion, which is a category I did not have in 2019, and same for body type. I also did not have that in 2019, so that's why there's no numbers for that, because I was not tracking that yet. So religion, well, it means there is that religion has plays a part in the book, or a larger part in the book. And body type is when the main character, for example, is fat, rather than most books tend to have straight-sized people. So people that are like medium. People who don't experience any negative things regarding their size, they have the privilege of. Now for this graph, I know in the previous years I had multiple graphs regarding diversity, but I decided to just show this one this year. But I should say that as you can see by the scale, 2020 has books read at like 550. Now, I did not read 550 books in 2020. If you watched part 1, you'll know I read 302 books. This is because if a book has no type of diversity at all, it's counted as none. But if it has multiple representation of minority groups, let's say there's a book in which the character is part of the LGBTQ plus spectrum, but there are also elements of mental health, for example, then it's counted in both of those categories, which I realize is not the perfect way to do this. But I kind of have that problem with like all of my graphs, that it is not. I don't have like a multi-category, because in a lot of the books I read that do have minority representation, it is more than one category. So I don't just want to lump all of that under multi, because that would be a lot of them. Thank you very much for watching part 7. Part 8 should be up soon, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!